Hey everyone, how you doing? So today we are going to be going over week 8. We're going to be covering the Middle East, and it's going to be approximately from 1500 or just around there, going through the Ottoman Empire and kind of expanding into the modern day. And we're going to have a few interesting topics. First one being discussing the Ottoman Empire. What was it? Why was it so stable for centuries? We're going to dip into the tail end of the Armenian Genocide. And then we're going to be looking at the Iranian Revolution under Khomeini and seeing why that was important, how that came about, and what kind of conversations we can have there. And lastly, we're going to go through some more modern topics of the Middle East, the Iraq-Afghanistan war. We're going to be going over the the downfall of Saddam, ISIS coming into fruition, and kind of wrapping up with Arab Spring revolts, the Syrian civil war, etc. So a lot of different topics today, as you might imagine. Middle Eastern history is beautiful and rich, but it is very complex and so many things going on. So this is obviously not a completely exhaustive look at the Middle East, but for our class purposes for this week, it's a nice snapshot. So some things kind of, moving forward. Topics for us to consider would be Ottoman Empire, the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts on top of that, the sort of rise of Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution, and those modern day highlights that I was discussing earlier. And so this is going to be, a pretty kind of nice overall look at the Middle East and how things have been transpiring in the last, few hundred years, and especially in more of the modern context. And so let's get into it. So without further ado, part 1, the Ottoman Empire after 1500. The prosperity to the downfall. Now, I do want to preface this and say, because this class is mainly for my GCC, courses, right? And so, obviously, Glendale is home to many Armenians, and the Armenian Genocide is a very important topic in the community, right? I'm half Armenian myself, and so I know, where we're all coming from. But sometimes I do meet individuals who, as soon as you say anything related to the Ottoman Empire, automatically they just block you out, and all they think about is the genocide in 1914 and the years leading up to it. But I would ask you to mainly just consider, the entire breadth of the conversation, right? The Ottoman Empire spanned for centuries. And it is notable to kind of discuss the pros and cons of the empire, and of course the unfortunate end of the empire that led into the genocide. So I'm just asking just to kind of separate some animosities, if you have any, and then for us to kind of get into a nice kind of intellectual discussion. But the Ottoman Empire itself originated with kind of these nomadic Seljuk Turks, right, and sort of the steppes of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kurdistan, all of those kind of stans, right, in the Central Asian countries that exist today. And so these were battle-hardened warriors on horseback, right, nomadic tribesmen, the Seljuk Turks. And the Seljuk Turks were pretty fearsome, warriors, and they were just cutting a bloody path through the Iranian sort of Persian territories, and then kind of moving westward. And I'll show maps and everything to detail this, but long story short, the Seljuk Turks, after cutting a bloody path, they made their way to modern-day Turkey, where the Byzantine Empire was still surviving. And then slowly they just kept hammering and hammering away at the Byzantines until finally, in 1453, the Byzantine Empire crumbled when Constantinople, the fabled Constantinople city of the Byzantine Empire, of the Eastern Roman Empire, the new sort of center of Rome and Romans, finally crumbled to the Ottomans and their great cannon fire on their triple walls. And so the Ottomans were born. The Ottoman Empire was born after that. It's their namesake coming from Osman I, sort of the leader of the group. And so the Ottoman Empire, from its original core and roots, right, from the Seljuk Turks, was a very kind of militaristic, aggressive society, right? As you have to be to defeat empire after empire after empire, right? And finally make your way to the Byzantines and defeat them on top of that. And so, the Ottomans immediately kind of solidified themselves in the ancient world, right? Or even around the 1500s or so, when this class is supposed to start, as these kind of undefeated, fearsome warriors. And their empire would spread, throughout the eastern part of the Mediterranean, right? They were a very large territory and empire, and pretty successful too, because they lasted more than 600 years, ending in 1922. So, for an empire lasting for 600 years, you have to be doing something correctly, right? And, aside from their military prowess, we're going to get into, discussing some of their kind of trading, some of their economic policies, their governance policies, for us to understand, why this empire lasted as long as it did, and how some of the minorities, including the Armenians, were living within this empire at the time. And then one last thing I'll say about the sort of fearsome fighting force of the Seljuks. So it's kind of notable during Middle Eastern history, and we're not going to get into this too much right now. This is more for my kind of early world history class, where we're discussing the different sort of caliphates, the rise of Islam, the Assyrians, right? All of those kind of empires that came before. The typical notion in the Middle East is that the sort of more aggressive, sort of militarily dominant force is going to start taking over. And typically we see in the Middle East, different empires rise and then they fall. And the other ones rise and then they fall. The reason being is, let's say if you are the first person on the scene, right? You are that battle-hardened warrior who was just living off the land, like you're tough, you're gruff. You can kill 5 men with, a single swing of the sword or whatever. And then you're cutting up a bloody path into whatever territory, and you set up this grand empire. Let's say your children are going to be, your kids, and so they're going to be still kind of tough and gruff, but not nearly as aggressive or as mean and determined, because they did not have your upbringing. And let's say your grandchildren are going to be born in lavish prosperity because they are the grandkids of the famous emperor or the sultan or whatever. And so they're going to be even more lax. So essentially, over time, the city dwellers get soft and lazy, and then whoever ends up being the sort of battle-hardened nomads living off of the steppes, they're going to come in and smash them, right? And we kind of see the cyclical, thing going on over time. But Osman the First, right, kind of the first, not exactly called or nicknamed the Sultan yet, but just the first leader, right, of the Ottomans, for their Ottoman Empire namesake. Definitely carved out a pretty size of territory for himself. But the Seljuk era, like I said, let me get my pointer here. They originated somewhere in the sort of like Central Asian steppes, right? And then they started coming down aggressively, in the, approximately 1100s, 1200s or so, and just kept coming in first, pounding away at the sort of Persian Empire and the Persian territories, and just pushing west, smashing Baghdad, smashing Damascus and Mosul, all of these other territories. And the Byzantines over here on the left-hand side, the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire, suddenly saw these massive waves of these just horseback warriors. And they were just winning battle after battle. They could not compete against them on the open battlefield. And so the Byzantines had a very difficult time of challenging them, and eventually they even too succumbed to the Seljuks. An interesting thing, just as a side note here, where I'm pointing, the Seljuks of Rum. So if you ever see that on a map, why are they called the Seljuks of Rum, right? Or rum. Not nicknamed after the drinking rum, but they're called the Seljuks of Rum because after they essentially defeated the Byzantine Empire, they incorporated the name into the tribe. So we are the Seljuks of Rome, right? So we are the inheritors of Rome. We are the new Caesars, right? Sort of a might equals right type of mentality. And so just as a side note, in case if anyone was interested. And so this would be kind of similar, right, to maybe some kind of, old Turkic horseback warriors, very proficient with bow and arrows, very proficient with their swords on horseback. And so if you could imagine tens and tens of thousands of these warriors just, migrating across the fields and the territories, a pretty unstoppable force, honestly. And so you have to give them credit. And we even have old Byzantine reliefs of, said, let's say, battles against these, fabled horsemen. And here we can see all of the kind of various horse warrior relief, right? And so they were, absolutely ferocious in their battle and were renowned as such. They were so renowned that we still have, these primary sources, right, from centuries later. And so one of the kind of inheritors of the Ottomans, this was maybe one or two short generations after Osman, but Suleiman I was nicknamed Suleiman the Magnificent because as the Ottoman Empire is born, as they just defeated the Byzantines, they started to aggressively expand, as you would do if you have, a very powerful and capable military. And so he starts to aggressively expand, pushing into Europe, even getting as far as Vienna and bombarding the heck out of Vienna, and truly kind of establishing Ottoman Seljuk dominance, right? In the Balkans and around the Eastern Mediterranean. And so, his rule was seen with successful military campaigns and also him creating this very powerful and robust bureaucracy, this governmental bureaucracy that was highly efficient, very motivated, and was just pouring in money. And so on top of them now being militarily dominant in the region, they had so much prosperity. And some primary sources that we have, one from Lopez de Camara. He was a Spanish writer who was chronicling the conquistador Cortes in the 1540s. He wrote of Suleiman. Suleiman possessed as much as did the Romans. But we see that because of our sins, Suleiman succeeded better than Charles at satisfying his wants and managing his intrigues. The Turks succeeded better at fulfilling their projects than did the Spanish. They devoted themselves fully to the order and discipline of war. They were better advised. They used their money more effectively. So essentially, they were taking everything that was around them, government-wise, bureaucracy, military-wise, and they were just testing it to the epitome of its limits. Another source later on, this is some centuries later, towards the tail end of the Ottomans in the late 1800s. But here we have a primary source from Sir William Eaton. He was a U.S. Army officer. And when he visited the Ottoman Empire in the 1800s, he said, "It is undeniable that the power of the Turks was once formidable, far surpassing their opponents. All trembled at the name of the Turks. Conquest was to them a passion, a gratification, hence their zeal for the extension of their empire." And so widely known and understood, right, that they were militarily just dominant. They were sort of the big superpower of the day and age, and they truly were. There's a reason that they lasted for 600 years, right? This was a great, grandiose, powerful empire. And so as you are spreading and extending and expanding your borders and your territories, right, as this now Muslim big Ottoman Empire, how do you manage the people living within your empire, right? And we've seen this in some of our other lectures with these big empires like the Russians and others, where you cannot really have a singular homogeneous population, right, of the same people, the same religion, the same culture, etc. If you are really going to conquer and expand large territories, there are going to be different types of people, different religions, different languages, different cultures. And so inevitably an empire does need to be flexible enough in order to accommodate for all of these individuals. And the Ottoman method for doing so was called the millet system. So the millet system was, it was like a term that they used to apply for like minorities, right, and kind of different folks living within the empire. But essentially, the millet system was very good. It essentially left all of these regions semi-autonomous to govern themselves and to just do whatever it is that they needed to do. However, there were, a few stipulations. Number one, you had to pay your taxes, of course. I believe it was what Thomas Jefferson famously said: the two things that are, known in life are death and taxes, right? But you had to pay your taxes, and if they needed to, ask any additional levies from you, you had to, give it. But there was obviously a kind of tiered hierarchy system where the Muslims were considered number one. Everyone else was considered a bit secondary, but as long as you just paid your taxes, right, and you kept out of trouble, you were perfectly fine. And so we do have, all of this evidence of, a lot of internal security, internal prosperity, during the breadth of these kind of 600 years that we're talking about. And so, living under Ottoman rule was honestly not too bad. You paid some taxes, you had military protection because nobody was going up against the Ottomans for quite some time. Even if they did, they were pretty strong enough to, fight back. And so, living within the borders was pretty safe, as far as everything else is concerned. And so I do want to kind of dispel that myth that a lot of, let's say, folks have in terms of, let's say, the genocide, Armenian genocide and whatnot, where, everything that came before the genocide, like, they kind of just forget about, but we do have to keep this into context. And we're going to get to the genocide and how it happened and why it occurred in a second. But later on, as the millet system and as the Ottoman Empire is aging, and we get into the 1800s, right, a few decades before the empire really crumbled, the empire itself started to falter a bit. And we'll kind of discuss some of the reasons why. But from the 1850s approximately and onward, even earlier than that, I would probably say 40s and 30s, we start to see these kind of imperial reforms start. And we're going to start to see, how and why they came into being. And so this is kind of like just a charter diagram, just to maybe put this into perspective. Like under the millet system, right, or whatever the religious community system-based hierarchy they had, we had the dominant millet system, or the dominant millet categorization, which is as the Muslims. And so you are, the number one. You're the top dog. And everyone else, all of the non-Muslims, doesn't matter who you were, Jewish, Christian, pagan, whatever. You paid your taxes, we're good with you, right? And so they were considered second-class subjects, but once again, money talks. And so the Ottoman Empire stretched quite a long ways, all the way from North Africa to Egypt to surrounding sort of the coasts of the peninsula of Arabia, all the way into modern day like Azerbaijan, Georgia, Crimea, going all the way up into, let's say, Hungary and Austria-Hungary, right? So this was a large empire, plenty of manpower, money, resources, and everything else in between. But where there is a rise, there inevitably has to be a fall or demise. That is true for every empire of history. And so I kind of alluded to this not too long ago, but in the 1800s, the empire started to falter a bit. And this ties in with our other lectures on industrialization, modernization, etc. Because as Europe is, and other parts of the world, are getting the factories and kind of, machines and all of these different things to like modernize themselves, it starts to wear down the Ottomans. Because the Ottoman Empire, just like traditional economics before sort of industrialization popped in, everything was based off of textile industries. And by textiles, I mean you're making things with your hands, and you're making good quality products. And so the Ottomans were fantastic at this because they had, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, or probably millions, of individuals just making all of these products, right? And their economy was flourishing for centuries. But as soon as modernization came into the game, the Ottomans and the imperial rule, they were very slow to actually adopt any of these modernization tactics because to a certain extent they didn't need it. So imagine if you are the Sultan, right, of the Ottoman Empire. You are all powerful and you have your strong military and armies and your economy is, flourishing and your imperial coffers just have gold beyond belief. And then like your advisor comes in and says the Europeans are having these factories and these machines. He's like, why do I need that? Like we're so rich, right? Why do we need it? And so they were at the superpower status, right? And so they didn't necessitate a change. They didn't see a desire to do so. But slowly it started to ebb away their power because as Europe starts to really industrialize, as the United States and other areas of the world and Japan and China, all these places we've been like seeing and talking about, as everyone is industrializing, they are pumping out all of the goods that the Ottomans are, but for cheaper. And so slowly the Ottoman economy just starts to get slower and slower. And it's a gradual decline too. And so it's not something sharp and drastic, right? But it's a very gradual decline. But over time, we start to see that by the mid, 1800s or so, the empire really needs like something to be done. And the Tanzimat reforms are one of the famous ones where, starting in 1839 or so, all the way up into the late 1800s, these reforms were specifically made out to consolidate some of the, kind of social, economic, and political, realms. They were, trying to, modernize a bit in whatever form or facet that they could. And implement different kind of new Western modalities. And so essentially what this means is the Ottomans were looking at Europe and saying, Europe is now becoming the superpower, right? And we have faltered from our previous pedestal of superpowerdom. They're doing something right. So let's incorporate some Western industrialization, some Western constitutions and forms of government and whatever else, because we have to change some stuff. And so they tried to implement all of this. And it was a slow implementation. They had some early constitutions drawn up, some early parliamentary systems, trying to reform their economies a bit. But they could not necessarily reform the economy too much because it was kind of too late. Because at this point, a lot of the European companies and nations had already signed these unfair trading agreements with the Ottomans, who didn't know better at that time. And so the trade disparity was already set and rooted. And so the Ottomans found themselves in an inevitable just decline. And this decline was nicknamed the sick man of Europe, because the Ottoman Empire did extend into the Balkans, right? Modern day Greece, Romania, right? All these territories. And so they were nicknamed the sick man of Europe because they were, having this big bloated governmental bureaucracy that was once a strength and once was very effective. Now it was seen as a burden and it was bringing them down. They had more and more debt accumulated because their economy was not as strong and robust as it used to be. And all of these unfair trading agreements and contracts they had signed with Europe was to their detriment. And so we see that by the time World War I rears its ugly head, that the Ottoman Empire has fallen from grace. They fell from their military and economic prosperity. They fell from being a superpower. They really were just knocked down a few tiers. And so by World War I, there is all of this kind of, discussion of him being the sick man of Europe, right? Needing to take, some rest. The Ottoman Empire is not who they used to be. Over here on the left-hand side, this cartoon, the other European powers are just like taking and grabbing territory away from the Ottomans. And then, the Sultan is kind of just like, I don't want to do anything. Or I can't do anything. kind of being portrayed as powerless. On the right hand side, the Ottoman Turk just kind of looking, and it's like, oh, this poster on reorganization of the empire, and the directors of this reorganization are Russia, France, and England. He kind of just like looking a little bit lost, and so all of these kind of cartoons and discussions of the Ottoman Empire at the time were seeing it as really just being taken for granted and taken advantage of. Even this one, this is from more of like a Russian perspective, right? The Russian Empire was seen as this big, monstrous empire, just kind of, having all of its tentacles, extend everywhere, and, just grabbing the Ottomans over here by the leg, and by the arm, right? Kind of just like trying to, nip at them a bit. And so the Ottomans, it seems, were at this point at a disadvantage because they were bordered both by Europe and by Imperial Russia on the right-hand side. And so Imperial Russia and the Ottomans, they had wars before, they've had battles, they've had disagreements, right, historically, and they still do. Putin still doesn't really like Erdogan. But, the sort of slopes of the Caucasus, right, those big battlegrounds between the Ottomans and the Russians kept continuing. And so another kind of aspect of the Ottoman decline was all of this war money being spent on the fields against the Russians. And so that kind of continued and ebbed away at their finances and their kind of prosperity and just their global outlook on themselves. Because the once proud sultans and the once proud, let's say, Seljuk Turks were now, fighting for their lives against the Russians, winning some, losing some wars. Their trade agreements were very disadvantageous with the Europeans, and so they saw that their money was being slowly ebbed away, unemployment was rising, all of these terrible different things. And so by 1922 or so, right, a little bit after World War I, and World War I definitely exacerbated all of these issues, right, in the empire itself, forcing them to spend even more money on military that they did not really have, and it just an already fractured system had an additional large weight put on it, and it just shattered. And so what was once a very prosperous, multi-ethnic, culturally diverse, and lenient empire turned into, sadly, towards World War I, a radical authoritarian state hell-bent on keeping and retaining whatever power or prosperity or a semblance of national unity and national respect that they once had. And so this is where the Armenians come into the fray. I purposefully introduced the millet system because the Armenians were not unique. They were just one of the millets. They were the Armenians, the Jews, they were the Lebanese, they were the Egyptians, they were anybody, right? They were just all part of the millet system. You pay some taxes, we're good with you. And so for centuries, the Armenians actually enjoyed quite a bit of prosperity under the Ottoman rule. And in my studies at UCLA, under the history chair, which specializes in Armenian history, the various discussions we were having years ago was that Armenians are part of what is known as the Diaspora Immigrants. Diaspora meaning that your people are dispersed throughout the world. The three main diaspora immigrants are the Jews, the Greeks, and the Armenians. And for the Armenians, the reason that they have now become truly a diaspora group is because of the Armenian Genocide. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But, even as they were living throughout the Ottoman Empire, they had and enjoyed an enormous amount of success and financial stability because they had the sort of imperial military protectors. And what do Armenians know how to do amongst all other things that they're great at? They are great business people. I don't know why. Probably because they were in the Caucasus and they're at the center of the Silk Road and all this trade. They were like master businessmen. And so we have all of this evidence throughout the Ottoman history of these wealthy Armenian merchants, especially in the mercantile system. Wealthy Armenian merchants coming into prominence. making trade routes all the way from, let's say, England all the way through the empire down into the Philippines, right? Just enormous, vast trading networks. And so some of the Armenians were even, let's say, in Istanbul, right? What used to be Constantinople, but they renamed it Istanbul, right? Because it is now a Muslim Ottoman-owned territory. Even some Armenians who were so wealthy were acting as Muslims, because in the city itself, in Istanbul, only Muslims could ride a horse, for instance, right? It was illegal for anyone else to do so. Some of the local Armenians were so wealthy and so influential, they were riding a horse publicly throughout the street. And so, kudos to them. But as you might imagine, let's say as a local Ottoman or Turk, seeing these kind of things, the empire is radically declining. Your position in the world is declining as well. And now you're seeing, some immigrant groups, some minority groups, such as the Armenians and others, kind of being even wealthier and more powerful than you. So in addition to all of this, we have to keep it into context that the 1800s, and especially this 1900 post modern era beginning, nationalism was on the rise. Every single person or a group of people wanted their group identity, right, spoken to. And so now, more than ever, the Germans were saying, we have to be Germans for Germans only. The Spaniards were saying, Spain for Spain only. And following suit, because the Tanzimat reforms were getting all of these Western ideals to try to modernize the Ottoman Empire, now the Ottomans were looking at Europe and saying, oh, well, nationalism is just, spreading like wildfire. We should start nationalism too. And so they incorporated nationalism, and once again, Turks and, Ottomans for the Ottoman Empire. And tragically, this ended up leading to the Armenian Genocide. It is multifaceted and for many different reasons why it occurred, but I'll try to cover just a few. And I'll get into it a little more in depth right after this slide. But essentially, the Armenian Genocide was a cleansing. It was a killing of approximately 1.5 million or so Armenians ethnically, for the purpose of just eradicating them and getting them out of the empire. It did not necessarily only happen in 1914. It started previous to that. We have reports as far back as 1894 of various villages being set on fire and various attacks beginning. And so this left the Armenian people even more so than ever, leaving them with this sort of very pragmatic and survivalist mentality, coupled with, let's say, the cultural affinity that they have for, let's say, mercantile just trading, right? Anywhere else that they got just spread into the world because of the genocide, and they had to leave the territory. Wherever they went through in the Middle East or Russia or the United Kingdom or South America, Australia, United States, they were very pragmatic and survivalist people, right? The first generation works hard. They force their kids to go to school, get good degrees, and start up a business or do whatever else. And so very quickly the Armenian community just built itself up in all of these various places, priding themselves on education and having, as much as they can, white collar jobs. My parents did the very same thing. We came here and my parents had to essentially put in all the gruff work so that I could go to school and, now be a professor, right? And now kind of have a white collar job, even though I'm wearing a blue collar here. But you know what I mean. And, hopefully my kids in the future, as many as I'll have, hopefully they'll all be doctors and lawyers and engineers, and I could just sit back in the Caribbean with a cigar and just, have fun. But, that's kind of the idea. Not just unique to Armenians, for everyone else. But the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, like I said, did enjoy quite a bit of prosperity. We have photographs here of, them dressing in typical kind of Ottoman, wear, because they, were part of the empire. They were, Ottomans, but Armenians living within the empire structure today. It's very similar to how now Armenians, let's say, living in the United States. We are Armenian American. So these were Armenian Ottomans, right? Kind of very similar dynamics there. Some folks, right, such as, let's say, the patriarch, the Armenian patriarch, whenever he had his center of base in Istanbul, was highly influential and highly regarded, right, within both the religious community and the political community abroad. We started getting, all of these kind of Armenian groups, meeting up and kind of having, various kind of meetings and connections and kind of bands and kind of enjoyments amongst themselves. This one is kind of in the more like the villages and the fields, within Anatolia itself. But as you can see here, right, slowly folks are starting to westernize, wear suits and everything. So all of that kind of Tanzimat reform ideal is kind of, seeping in. And so as we're seeing like photographs here of the Hagia Sophia, right, inside Istanbul. All of these kind of big, large trading cities, that were once filled with different folks, different merchants and peoples and ideas and goods, exactly what the Ottoman Empire used to stand for. All of these people just kind of living under one banner peacefully. Eventually, we see the rise of nationalism with the incorporation of the Tanzimat reforms, the sort of the willful acceptance of Europeanization and industrialization and ideals started to force the Ottomans, just like everyone else in Europe, to have the rise of nationalism, to have the rise of Ottomans first, everyone else second, right? And we're definitely going to put that into practice. And to our right-hand side, the photo here is the first council, right, the parliamentary council that ended up creating what was known as the Young Turk organization. And so this was a radical political organization that took everything we just discussed into account. And they understood the history. They understood their founding fathers. They understood the sort of disadvantage that the Ottoman Empire was currently in, militarily, economically, etc. They were also well read in nationalist European rhetoric. Some of them had, European educations, and so they were bringing back all of these different elements. But the one main thing that they really took from their education, unfortunately, was hyper-nationalism, to the point where the Young Turks would start to gather up into various meetings. And here we have the founding members of the Young Turk organization. But they essentially met and had this understanding that we need to create a very Ottoman empire, a nationalistic empire, and anyone opposing it will be, pushed aside. And so, unfortunately, the scapegoat in this particular era was the Armenians. And so, over the number of years, they started to go through village after village, cleansing the population, killing and murdering folks, going through death marches in the desert. And so if you can imagine, right, over the years, killing up to 1.5 million or so individuals, that is a very extensive amount of effort, right, being taken towards the extermination of a populace. And this historical period of time, it's still, quote unquote, in contention today. The majority of the world agrees and recognizes that this was the first genocide of the 20th century, right? And the Holocaust, the very famous Holocaust under Hitler, being the second. One of Hitler's very famous sayings was, look at what happened to the Armenians under the power of the Turks. Who is to remember the Armenians? And Hitler essentially used that excuse as a justification for his own Holocaust, right? Because it's like, nobody cared about the Armenians, so I can exterminate the Jews if I want. And so the Armenians started to see their land taken away, their livelihoods taken away, their businesses ransacked, their men killed, their women raped and killed, the kids being sold to different families. Just terrible, terrible times. And we have primary photographs here of these early Armenian militias forming to defend their homelands, to defend their territories, right? Kind of strapping themselves with rifles, strapping themselves with bandoliers and everything else, forming these coalitions, as we see here on the right-hand side, right? Trying to defend themselves and trying to not have this occur to their villages, where all of the Ottoman soldiers are taking and rounding up the individuals and sending them to death marches and just leaving them on the sides of the street. If the kids are, hungry, malnourished, dehydrated, right, they're just thrown on the side of the road. And the reason that they performed the death marches later on through the deserts is because eventually, they were needing to save ammunition. And so why spend a bullet when they could just perish in the hot sun? And so even later, we have photographic evidence. Unfortunately, not as much photograph or especially, let's say, video evidence as we have of the Holocaust, because technology was more widely spread in the 1940s as it was here. But even here, we have photographs of these British reconnaissance soldiers kind of going through some of these villages later on, and seeing the massive graves and the massive bones of a lot of these exterminations. And so, seeing this obviously on a personal level is very conflicting and very troubling. But, as a historian, it is important to go through this history and narrative, because even today, we have sort of denial from the state of Turkey. But here are two videos. The one on the left-hand side is kind of a, kind of like a 3-4 minute sort of Nat Geo kind of look, right? And kind of like a small little highlight on what was the genocide, and kind of gives it a little perspective. On the right-hand side, if any of you are a fan of the band System of a Down with Serj Tankian, the sort of lead singer here, he describes what growing up as an Armenian individual and hearing stories from his grandparents of the genocide was like, and how he incorporates that into his worldview and identity, right? And all these other different kind of discussions and parallels that he makes. And so definitely worth a watch if you have some spare time. These next two videos, the one on the left-hand side is an Armenian artist. I believe it was in San Francisco, but don't quote me on that. And so an Armenian artist on the left-hand side wants to make sort of his emotional, personal tribute to the memory of the genocide, and to the ancestors, right? And so there's an interesting video on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, if anyone had actually got into business with this guy, I believe his business is on Brand Boulevard in Glendale or somewhere similar. I can't remember, the Manukian Law Group, something like that. But he is essentially a lawyer in Los Angeles. And here I found this great video of him from years ago, describing what it was like as an Armenian immigrant coming to the United States, wanting to get into law and practice and kind of build up your family again. And so this kind of gives also this kind of like immigrant experience, from a Middle Eastern kind of Armenian perspective, right? What it's like kind of growing up in the States and trying to make it. And so at the very tail end of the sort of World War I and the Ottoman Empire and the unfortunate and brutal and devastating Armenian genocide that occurred, the Ottoman Empire, for all of its once glorious sort of military expansion and economic dominance and it being a superpower, at the end of World War I was, on the tail end losing side of the war. And so all of these European powers essentially just took a pen and paper and arbitrarily just drew all of these lines and created nation states. Of course, nothing wrong is going to happen if you do that. And so they arbitrarily drew all of these lines from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, right, etc. They took all of these territories and just redrew them. And so that is going to have massive repercussions moving forward, and we'll see how. But an interesting look here at, this is a more modern connection to 2020, but in a recent situation, the territory of Armenia and Azerbaijan have been in conflict again. They have always been in the past, right, with some border disputes, but, sort of war has opened up a bit on the front again. And so here is a recent sort of press conference on the Turkish president Erdogan. Essentially, in his speech, which is a much longer speech, but in this small section, he alludes to, we will continue to fulfill this mission which our grandfathers have carried out for centuries in the Caucasus again. And so he essentially said that Turkey will stand with their brothers and sisters in Azerbaijan because they're both Muslim, and brothers in arms type of thing. But this is a very interesting thing for him to say, because publicly, and this is that controversy I was talking about, the Armenian Genocide, publicly for decades, the Turkish government has fully denied that the Armenian Genocide had ever taken place. And so they have even heavily lobbied the United States so that the United States never publicly admits that the genocide happened. We do have various individuals like our local Congressman Adam Schiff, right, that represents Glendale, right, an Armenian community here. But, on a large spectrum, the U.S. still has not accepted it. Multiple other countries have. But it's just interesting to me that Erdogan would choose these words, because as soon as he said this, everybody on my Instagram feed and on the internet and everyone else essentially said, but you're saying the genocide never happened, but by you saying we will finish what our grandfathers started, are you admitting that the genocide happened? It was a very kind of controversial thing. But, it's still the ramifications of kind of this age-old ethnic cleansing can still be seen today, unfortunately. Part 1 ended. Let's get into part 2, folks. The Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. And I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on this because God knows, pun intended, but God knows that it is so nuanced, and there's been so much conflict. I'm not sure how the ending is going to happen, but at least we can bring a little bit of context for our class. But at the very tail end of 2-3 slides ago, we saw that the Ottoman Empire was arbitrarily just redrawn with the pen and pencil based off of U.S. and European powers. They literally just redrew the map. But two things. Number one, they did not really take account into any of the religious or ethnic differences between all the communities, which is going to cause a lot of trouble later on. But also, for a number of years, from the late 19th century, the Jewish community around Europe and the world started to have this, what is known as Zionist ideology. Zionist ideology essentially saying, we have been a diaspora group spread across the world for centuries, but it is time for us to have an actual homeland. And so having this kind of historic land of Israel, land of our forefathers type thing. And I talk about this in some of my modern U.S. classes, but some of the Jewish community that was already, let's say, settled in the United States was saying, well, the U.S. is fantastic. This is our promised land here, right? We're doing great for ourselves. And there's nowhere near as much anti-Semitism in the U.S. than, let's say, Europe or Eastern Europe under the Russian pogroms, right? The ethnic cleansings there. And so the conversation around the world was like, we want some type of Jewish homeland. We're not sure how this is going to happen. But at the very tail end of World War I, once they were redrawing the maps, the United States was very adamant about adding in the, the Jewish state, and which we'll get to in a second. But, this whole Zionist ideology was in the same breath also happening at the same time as Arab unity was happening. And so I want to kind of set up this kind of dual ideology, right? Because both of them are essentially, kind of nationalistic movements, right? Springboarding from that European nationalism that we just discussed. And so the Jews want, and the Jewish community wants their own homeland. And then the Arabs, in whatever subset form that they were, launched their own national identities and homelands as well. And so, thanks to Mr. T.E. Lawrence, and if you ever have not seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, fantastic film. It's like 3 hours long, but God knows it's worth it. From T.E. Lawrence and all of his adventures in the Middle East during World War I, and essentially having guerrilla warfare and bombing the Ottoman railroads and such, he helped galvanize the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, and that Arab revolt started this Arab national unity kind of movement, and all the way up into kind of getting this state of Israel, right? Where the maps were redrawn and Israel was just like, boop, popped in on the map, where it never existed before. Now, before you start saying that, I might, not be as, let's say, sympathetic or anything else to the cause, I'm not making any personal stances here, but I think objectively, you can probably deduce that if Arabs in whatever form were living throughout the Ottoman Empire, including modern-day Israel, right? All just Arabic, Muslim type of people. And then suddenly, just with redrawing the map with a snap of fingers, you're just like, boom, this is Jewish homeland now. That is going to cause issues and tensions, right? Right off the bat, without you knowing anything else about what's going to happen in history or the future or whatever. Like, that's probably just going to cause tensions. Very similarly to how, I don't know, let's say if the city of Los Angeles suddenly receives, 100,000 Turkish nationalistic citizens right now. And then suddenly in the heart of Glendale, they carve out a whole section and they're like, oh, there you go, live peacefully with the Armenians side by side. Ooh, boy. That would be a little too, I'll get a little too crazy. But the State of Israel was created and was known as the Resolution 181. So as they're going through and trying to decide what to do with the Middle East, the British were in control of the territories of Palestine and Iraq and all of these different territories, right? Because the European powers just gobbled all of them up. And so they essentially just redrew the map and gave Palestine, which used to belong to the whatever they called the Palestinians, the Muslims living there who used to be under the Ottoman, rule. They named it the State of Israel. And they did have the territories of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank still given to the Palestinians, right? And so it was a weird, two-state system that was created here. And unlike other territories like Jordan or Syria or wherever else, it was pretty easy. You just, they kind of, relatively, quote unquote, easy. They redrew the map, and it just, the people are all kind of homogeneous and just living there. But here we have this from an early onset, kind of like this two-state system being created. And very tense, as you might imagine. But the most tense it has ever been to date has been the 6-Day War in 1967. So pretty much after a couple of decades, almost, right, like 20 years of them having this kind of two-state system, the countries around Israel, right, all of the Arabic countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, etc., they wanted to attack and essentially just destroy the Israel nation and kick them out. And, due to the Israeli organization, their fighting force, having brand new military equipment from the United States definitely did not hurt. They somehow, you got to give them credit, they clutched out a victory only in 6 days. And so as all of these forces were moving in and trying to destroy the Israelites, the Israeli jets and fighter forces, they made essentially very genius preemptive attack. And so they went to all of the airfields and bombed their air force to all hell, essentially just annihilating that part of the warfare. And eventually, once they were getting into the tank warfare as well, they had all these newer tanks provided by the U.S. military. And they were able to go toe-to-toe with them, on top of having the aerial superiority. And so, of course, even getting into the, sort of hand-to-hand combat and sort of like the on-ground combat, they were doing very well for themselves too. And we have to put things into context as well, that, they were also fighting for their homeland, right? The Arabs in all the Arabic countries were, let's say, the aggressors and they're attacking. But, if it doesn't work out, they can retreat back home. The Israels, right? If they lost, then their homes would not be there anymore. So they had that extra incentive to really fight. So to their credit, 6 days, clutched out of war. And then since then, over the last few decades, we have had, not as anything as crazy as, the 6-day war, but, various bombings here and there, disagreements, obviously, very tense moments between the Jewish communities and the Palestinian/Arabic communities. And, they have essentially tried to live together for all these decades and still to this day, but there are always kind of various tense moments that arise. A lot of the, let's say, kind of pro-Israel or pro-Jewish, I would say, let's say, programs that they have. One of the most famous ones is Birthright. I believe the Armenians have the same thing. I think it's called Birthright Armenia or something similar. I think they got it from here. Where if you can provide that you're of Jewish heritage, they fly you out to Israel for, I think it's like 10 days or 12 days, something like that. And you essentially relearn about your heritage and your birthright. And so it's a very nice kind of way for them to just let you know where you came from. Here's an interesting Vice special I found. Why evangelical Christians love Israel. So in our southern belt of the United States, why a lot of the Christians are like pro-Israel, pro-Zionist. Very interesting kind of outlook on that. And this is an interesting one. This is for the Atlantic. This is a Muslim journalist being sent to Israel, and he's talking to both Jewish leaders and Palestinians and Palestinian leaders too. And so it's as I nicknamed it, an imperfect look at the two-state system. And so his analysis and his sort of journalistic style is not perfect. No one's is, but you do get the sense that these people are trying to somehow live and coexist amongst each other. But there's racism, there's prejudice, on both sides. And as this gentleman in the thumbnail points out, he essentially says that in the modern context, the Jewish communities are definitely expanding, right? They are becoming more prosperous, albeit at the expense of the Palestinians that are still living within the territory of Israel. And so the two-state system, I don't know how well it's going to work in the future, but it is definitely, a bit tumultuous. And moving forward, it's definitely something that is going to continue being an issue. It might be just better to relocate all the Palestinians into the other neighboring Arabic countries, just so that there will not be this kind of racial, sectional, religious divide amongst them. But as it stands now, there's definitely been a multitude of issues, and there continue to be. I haven't even gone into the nitty-gritty stuff with Hezbollah and terrorist organizations, and let's say from the Gaza Strip, various rockets would be fired into Israeli territory by terrorist organizations, but those terrorist organizations were very smart, and they were firing from, let's say, the roof of a hospital. And so if the Israelis bombed back, then they would say, oh, well, you're destroying hospitals and kids. It gets very, very messy. And I'm not sure what the solution is here, but essentially Israel and Palestine have been in conflict for a long time. Each holds that the territory was theirs. If you watch the videos, they detail that the Israelis' argument is this is the land of our religious forefathers, and from Moses leading us here, this is our promised land of the Israelites, etc. The Palestinian argument is, okay, that's all fine and good, but our people have been living here for centuries under Ottoman rule, cue in the Ottoman discussions we had, So my family's been here for generations, and suddenly you guys just boom moved in, and now we're being treated like second-class citizens. Like, what's going on here? We're not going to move. We're not going to leave. And so those two points are just clashing and butting heads. But let's move on to the Iranian Revolution, the rise of Khomeini. Do I know any Persian words? Any Farsi words? Chetori. I think that's the only one I know. If anybody speaks Farsi in class, I apologize if I have an accent. I love all of my Iranian friends and Persian Armenians. But anyways, let's continue. Another major crucial aspect in the Middle East in the last few decades, kind of moving into a little more modern context, right, is the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the rise of Khomeini. And so let's detail what it was, how it happened, why is it important. And so this guy is almost never talked about. And I think it's very important to talk about him and what happened. So this guy, his name is Prime Minister, I hope to God, I pray to God I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Mossadegh? Prime Minister Mossadegh? Hopefully that's correct. But he was the last democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. And, truly as he came into power and he had a lot of these ideas to really kind of bring the Iranian government and the people into the 20th century, into, having more European ideals. He wanted to nationalize and consolidate some of the resources of the country. The United States and, the CIA did not agree with this, mainly because the British intelligence, MI6, came up to them and said, hey, this prime minister is nationalizing all of the very lucrative and wealthy petroleum industry and oil reserves and oil refineries that are under British, or were under British ownership. Now they suddenly nationalize it and the British are getting nothing. And so they go to the United States and say, hey, help us depose the prime minister. And so on top of both of those nations not particularly liking the prime minister for wanting to do good for his people, the Shah, the sort of monarch, autocratic ruler, right, of Iran, he also did not particularly like him because the prime minister was also trying to diminish his powers. And so we have all this evidence of the Shah traveling to the United States, traveling to Britain, talking with the leaders, and essentially they all plan all of this, coup d'etat, right, of the prime minister and his role in the Iranian government. And, through billions of dollars spent, the CIA eventually starts to pay for these professional riots to happen on the streets of Tehran and elsewhere. And eventually Mossadegh was forced out. But he was, at one point in time, even on Time magazine as Man of the Year. He was, and if you notice on the cover, on the imagery, all of the fists, right? Those kind of revolution fists, as we've had discussions of over the past few lectures with the Bolshevik Revolution, these sort of Castro, Che Guevara, fists in the air, very famous. Still has, right, roots today with the sort of Black Lives Matter movement, right, with the black fist up in the air for like revolution, resistance, and fighting. Maybe some Marxist ideals in there somewhere, but that's another discussion. But the prime minister here was part of Time magazine, Man of the Year, right, trying to do good for his people as much as he could. But the CIA and this gentleman over here, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, part of the CIA, was having discussions with the prime minister, and essentially just writing up documents of how they are going to overthrow, right, the individual and bring the Shah into power again. And so once he was tossed out, the Shah of Iran came back into power. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, or just known as the Shah. And so he started to institute what is known as the White Revolution. It was a turning point in Iranian sort of issues where he attempted to create more land reforms, economic reforms, etc., but at the detriment of the democratic government. And so just like our discussions of, let's say, the Ottoman Empire or anywhere else, he was definitely gaining more power as a monarch, as an autocratic ruler. Some things he did well, as all kind of leaders of empires or these large states do. Other things he did not. And so one of the better things, let's say, was the education, the emancipation, and enfranchisement of women, for instance, right? Going to school, getting educated, going to university, all these good things. Like one of the cons was, your personal freedoms were a little less, right? They had secret police everywhere through through Iran. So you had to be careful what you said. So stuff like that. There's pros and cons to everything, and life is never just black and white. But the Shah, Shah meaning kind of you're an emperor, you're a king, right? You're kind of a lord of Iran, traditionally speaking. You're the monarch. He started to have more Western influence on Iran and what he needs to do to bring Iran into sort of this new age of industrialization, westernization, and such. And so he furthered education, furthered women's emancipation, had many business partnerships with the West, and was essentially under the umbrella of the United States because of the Cold War, because they were sharing a border with the Soviet Union. And so the threat was, what if the Soviets attack, right? So the U.S. said, no, don't worry, we got your back on this. And so, the Shah was helped by the CIA to get back into power. Well, he was already in power, but to, assume even more power than what he had. And he had billions of dollars in aid, which brought him into power. But unfortunately, as the years are going to go on, the next 20 plus years, it's going to slowly lead to a more anti-American sentiment because the Shah was essentially just propped there by the U.S. intervention. And so over time, we start getting more and more civil protests. As we're getting into the 70s, as we're getting into the late 70s, we start getting more of an economic slump. We start getting more unemployment. We start getting people resenting his sort of monarchical, autocratic rule. The secret police just being around and listening to everybody. And probably most importantly, as soon as they were having these civil protests, which by itself would be fine, right? You could have a civil protest, you could have a discussion with the people and maybe make the country better. But whenever they had these massive civil protests, the Shah sent in police and they essentially would shoot into the crowd and just, rally a few of them and take them into the secret police headquarters and beat the living hell out of them and torture them. And so for many people now, especially with the violent suppression, they were seeing the Shah as a repressive institution, right? This very kind of oppressive monarchy institution. And so that amount of oppressiveness linked with, let's say, him and his ties. The Shah is over here on the left-hand side, here with Kennedy, JFK. The anti-American rhetoric is growing more and more as people are disliking him. The Shah and his, sort of monarchy status and his wealth is now being resented more and more by the people because they were having some more economic issues. They were pumping out more college graduates than there were jobs, etc. But, he's still buddy-buddy with the United States. Right here he is with Lyndon B. Johnson and his their wives on the right-hand side. And so the Shah was doing pretty well for himself, just doing what he does, being a monarchical ruler and such, albeit a bit oppressive, but completely decked out and dazzled. Look at him. My goodness. He looks like a combination of, I don't know, it kind of reminds me of Byzantine/Russian jewels and robes a little bit, doesn't it? I don't know. It all looks gorgeous, though. Look at that little prince. The little handsome prince. But yeah, definitely he was not giving off as popular of a vibe or image. And the last vestiges of, let's say, female agency and being able to publicly wear shorts or skirts or anything else was slowly to go down the window. And so, although people were definitely seeing him as oppressive, there were still some positive elements. Let's not, once again, be black and white about this. People did have, oh my God, the 70s and the 80s hair. You gotta love it. So all of the bright colors and all of the 70s and 80s and all this Western ideals and Western clothing, Western music, all of this influence was proliferating into Iran, and people were eating it up. This is all taken from sort of Iranian magazines and models at the time. A completely different look than what we have today, right? In these sort of Muslim-dominated theocracy under what Khomeini started and created. He's long dead now, but this sort of theocracy government has remained. And so going from this to, let's say, modern day kind of suppression is definitely 180. But in comes the revolution. In comes Khomeini, where he was, an early on politician, revolutionary. He was being very critical of the Shah, very critical of his ties with the United States. And he was part of all these demonstrations that the civil protests were having, right? Because the initial civil protests were against the sort of oppressiveness of the Shah, and they wanted more kind of economic stability and a few other things that they were advocating for. And pretty soon, Khomeini starts to rise through the ranks. Slowly, he starts to have his voice be heard louder and louder. And up until, let's say, going up until like 1978, when the strikes were nationwide in Iran, the demonstrations were so large, mostly with younger student-led groups, but they were just paralyzed in the country, right? There was everywhere, and people just running through the streets. And as this was happening, the Shah was sending the police force in. And so they already saw him and the police force as kind of this brutal, repressive system. But now, even more so, we had troops firing squads into entire groups of protesters, running them over, right? Doing all these horrific things. That, it definitely just kept increasing the fervor of the demonstrations. And then the Shah finally saw the writing on the wall and left in 1979 in January to live in exile, visiting the United States later, which did not help his anti-American imagery. But, by February of that same year, Khomeini and his guerrilla and rebel troops stormed the imperial palace and whatever sort of regency government that was left behind by the Shah, and brought Khomeini into power. Now, these student-led groups initially wanted to have the best case scenario, right? They wanted peace, prosperity. They wanted change. They wanted things to be altered for the better. And they wanted more freedoms. They wanted, let's say, a more fair society, etc. And, fighting for their part in the government. And Khomeini essentially was playing both sides. He was playing both sides in terms of promising them that kind of fair society that they wanted, but also kind of advocating for the kind of religious Islamic resurgence, right? And for us to not forget that we are Muslims. Let us not forget that the Westerners, right, are the enemy. That the Shah is in bed with the Westerners and the enemy. And so, we start to see these student-led groups and these youngsters somehow getting a hold of all these rifles and AK-47s with their fresh university degrees and their university educations, thinking that they can change the world for the better. They can change the government for the better. Some of their parents, right, kind of growing up and reading all of these Marxist and Leninist ideals. And so these individuals had some influence from Marxist revolutions, some influence from the West and national identities and all these different things. And so the main idea at the time was, we're going to revolt And hopefully something better is going to be put in place of the Shah, because we do not like the Shah. He's being too oppressive as a monarch, and so we want something better in place of this. But the problem is that whenever you have these large-scale revolutions, sometimes, or oftentimes, things do not go according to plan. And so if, the anti-American rhetoric's starting, the flag burning is starting, the Khomeini sort of speeches and rallies are beginning, and all of this Islamic kind of resurgence is coming up, and now now pretty soon you have all of these massive demonstrations in terms of, let's say, religious revivals. It did not go the way that most people expected. It did not go the way that a lot of these student-led demonstrations expected. They wanted a better world with more Western freedoms, right? Let's say like America. That was seen as the ideal, the standard. And then somehow Khomeini, a very kind of religious right person, boom, just comes into power and completely changes the direction. And so, Khomeini, his ideology was that the Shah was a miserable, wretched man, went against everything Islam stood for. He was seeing Westernization not as progress, but as the moral, economic, and religious breakdown of society. Especially him viewing what happened to the prime minister, right, and the Shah being given even more power, right? Once the British and CIA interests were coming in and dictating what they wanted to happen in the country because of money and oil refineries. Him seeing that just added flame to the fire, right? That the Western powers are essentially still performing a version of colonialism around the world, i.e. under the guise of business and contract, but still the same. And so, he completely was against the West. He saw them as oppressive, propagating colonialism and oppressing the people under capitalism. So he wanted to institute Sharia law. He wanted to go back to the Quran under the Hadith. And he was going to be the supreme leader. And that was his title. And even today, his successor, is also considered the supreme leader. Sort of like the Muslim Pope, if you will. Because there's God, and then there's the supreme leader, and then there's the people. So they are the direct sort of link between God and the people. And so the main point here is, while he was publicly stating during the revolution about freedoms and people not being under injustice and tyranny of the Shah and all these different things, ironically enough, he himself would become later sort of the tyranny of the people. And what is known as like one of the most religious sort of crackdowns in modern history. And here's two videos to kind of detail and summarize and recap the Iranian Revolution if you have enough time to watch. The one on the right-hand side, definitely I would recommend. This is an interesting one. This is only a couple minutes long, but this is from my old professor during my master's program at Cal State LA, Dr. Afshin Mateen Asghari. And so he had an NPR special a year or two ago, and spoke on his role because he was one of those student protesters in the revolution. And so he was speaking on his experiences, and that's why I'm getting some of my information from here, is as the students, they viewed the Shah as oppressive. They were in the streets protesting and rioting. They were not sure what government was going to come next, but it was this general idea that it will be better than what we have now. And then Khomeini just kind of seemed to come out of nowhere and just sucked up the power in the vacuum. And then him and all of the other protesters essentially pretty much just said to themselves, oh shit. And the entire nation as well. And so now, right, into his older age, every single time he kind of visits Iran, some folks recognize, let's say, him or others that were kind of students and part of the revolution or something, these foreigners kind of coming back, right? And so some of them still give them flack, right? Because some of them kind of look at them as like, oh, you're the reason why we had Khomeini and all of the repressions. But the main key thing to understand about all of this is, like any other revolution, is you can revolt and have the best of intentions, but sometimes the revolt does not go as planned. Okay, part 4, modern day highlights. So I hope that the Khomeini part and the Iranian part was pretty good, but part 4, modern day highlights. Here we're going to be viewing a few different highlights on Syria and kind of other kind of modern day, like, Iraq, Afghanistan, ISIS, all of these different things. Because the Middle East, for at least my lifetime, right, in the last 20 plus years, has just been in the news constantly, just like this hotbed of strife and civil war and all of these kind of issues kind of going along. And so, as far as my old perspective of what happened in the Middle East in the last 20 years or so, in 2021, it's going to be the anniversary of September 11th. And so the Twin Tower attacks in New York City was seen as this big cataclysmic moment, because the new millennium just happened, right? The year 2000 finally came. And that's not something to scoff at. Like, you, as a people, as a humanity, right? You literally entered into the new millennium. I was like, oh, what kind of wonderful things are going to happen now? All of your old cartoons of like the Jetsons and all of the kind of futuristic stuff that might happen, you're like, is that going to actually come into fruition? Who knows? And so here we have the Twin Tower attacks, and the World Trade Center was just bombarded by airplanes and terrorist hijackers by Al Qaeda, famously under Osama bin Laden, ironically enough, Osama bin Laden back in the day during the during the Soviet-Afghanistan war, right, towards the tail end of the Cold War, the CIA and the United States were the ones giving money and funding and training to Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda to fight the Soviets. Now, in what is known as, in CIA terms, blowback, or a completely unintended consequence of interfering, right, in something. The blowback here was the completely unintended consequence of the World Trade Center getting exploded and getting, attacked. And so the main point here is that, this here was this major catalyst in American, or continued and renewed vigor of American intervention in the Middle East. And so, although, as we've seen, the Middle East has definitely had their fair share of conflicts and issues over the number of decades previous to this, this was only going to literally just put gasoline on the fire, right? Here are 2 videos on the Twin Tower attacks, in case some of you are a little too young to remember. Some of you, some of you were probably born around this time, so you were definitely too young to remember. Oh my God, I'm getting too old. But anyways, the Twin Tower attacks. So the video on the left-hand side is more of a kind of official news highlight of what happened. It shows the planes bombing and all of that. The video on the right-hand side, I definitely would recommend for you to watch. Nothing too gruesome, but it's literally like the scene out of, just a blockbuster film. It's like a handheld camera, and they detail like running through the streets, and you just see these people running away from these plumes and clouds of just debris and smoke everywhere. And so pretty frightening, right, to kind of be in that position. So definitely give it a watch if you have time. But the Twin Tower attacks were absolutely devastating. And, definitely were seen as both a hit to, this U.S. hegemony, U.S. superpower, in the world, that anyone dared to kind of bomb the United States in this aspect and manner. But, the results that happened from this major terrorist attack was that the United States would now embark on this ruthless, counter-vengeance wars. And this is the Pentagon here. Absolutely in ruins, and the Union Tribune, right? Just showing everything on the newspapers. Terrible, terrible attack. And so immediately, Bush, George W. Bush, my generation's Donald Trump. In retrospect, we didn't know how good we had it, but all the analysis that they were doing back in this day and age, and all the things that I remember hearing on the news and seeing, the perspectives were essentially that the United States and the UN and other foreign nations were going in and trying to do their own analysis, and somehow they said, well, even though the terrorist bombers were Arabic and a few other folks and funded by Saudi Arabia and all these different terrorist groups and blah, 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 somehow it was Iraq's fault and Saddam Hussein's fault, and he has potential weapons of mass destruction, and he has new chemical weapons, etc. And so in what is seen as one of the biggest modern blunders in U.S. or just world history, like Iraq had almost nothing to do with the war, and they were pretty much the scapegoat. And I am still unsure to this day why exactly Iraq was chosen for this, why Saudi Arabia, let's say, was not held accountable, because that would have been the more fitting, or just the terrorist group in general, right? And just work with all of the different nations to get the terrorists. But Iraq was seen as the scapegoat, and you can see Bush giving his wartime speech here. And then, funny enough, by the closer towards the end of his presidency, he declared mission accomplished on one of the big U.S. carriers that he was visiting. Oh, how wrong he was, because we would still stay in the fight for more than a decade after that. And here's a video discussion of a ex-general giving his giving his analysis on the downfall of Iraq, and how the entire Iraq invasion happened, why they chose Iraq, what were the goals in Iraq, which many of them just did not know what the heck was going on. It was literally just utter confusion. And so part of me wants to, kind of spin this up to analysis of some sort of Illuminati conspiracy theory of, well, we went in for the oil reserves. Maybe, who knows? But definitely no weapons of mass destruction found after we invaded. No chemical weapons found after we ended up hanging Saddam Hussein. But here's a couple of videos kind of detailing the entire Iraq incident and conflict, and talking a little bit about Afghanistan. I'm not going to get too much into Afghanistan just because there's not as much information that I gathered from here. Most of it was kind of on Iraq, and I want to kind of focus on that a little bit more. Afghanistan has pretty much for the last number of decades just been a battleground between Afghan Soviet forces, Afghan US forces. It's like the new Vietnam. No matter how much a foreign power keeps throwing their money around into Afghanistan, the local people and the Taliban and all of these different groups are resisting the foreign powers and saying, no, get out of our country. Even today, I think people can probably say that the United States being in Afghanistan, let's say, was not as quote-unquote successful as they wanted it to be. And so we are withdrawing our troops as of now. Hopefully the Afghanistan government can be strong enough to, let's say, keep terrorism low enough. But, it's a consistent fight. And so here I want to get into a slight analysis of Iraq, because Saddam Hussein was portrayed and painted as this evil tyrant. And he was the president for quite a long time, over multiple U.S. Presidential administrations. But us kind of discussing the Ottoman Empire and, Middle East history, a recurring theme that we're going to keep seeing is that in all of these Middle Eastern countries, the most successful, or I would say the most stable rule has been kind of this authoritarian model, not when democratic principles are kind of put into place. And so here with Saddam Hussein, he essentially grew up in a very small village, did not have too much education growing up, but he was very street smart. He was a real, like, gruff guy. And he essentially saw Iraq, which was just at each other's throats between the Sunnis, the Shiites, and all of the internal just rivalry going on. And by the time he came into power, he essentially just said, I'm putting a stop to all of it. Famously, whenever one, let's say, Sunni village was doing something terrible, to the other one, he essentially, to make it fair, he, let's say, completely killed or bombed both villages just to show both sides that I don't care. I'll put all of you to death. You better fall into line. Ruling with an iron fist, right? And so, the main question I have to ask here is, should authoritarian leaders be left to their own devices if they are keeping the peace, quote unquote, in the region of the world? Because this has been a question in U.S. politics and in the U.S. sphere for decades. Whether it's Saddam Hussein or anybody else. Oh, they're a terrible tyrant. They're a dictator. The U.S. has to come in and do something. The United States has to come in and bring democracy and freedom to this people, etc., whatever, right? We've heard it so many times in the news. But, me analyzing this situation here, Saddam Hussein, unquestionably, right, was a very brutal guy. And our, historical records showed that at least 200,000 people over his years of rule were put to death, silenced, or whatever else, right? But he kept the peace. And we will analyze, what's going to happen in the aftermath right now. Because let's say in comparison, from 1979 to 2003, a couple 100,000 have to die and perish, and he maintains the peace as this sort of very autocratic ruler. Once the United States comes into war in Iraq, we have over 1 million dead. And in the power vacuum that ensues, once the U.S. tries to pull out, ISIS, if anybody remembers that from a few years ago, came into prominence with a few 100,000 more dead. And so the question has to be asked, number-wise, which is the more lenient option? Having a dictator in power who maintains peace in the region and kind of the status quo with 200,000 dead, or us trying to bring in democracy and freedom and we have 1.5 something million dead, similar to the Armenian Genocide. You know what I mean? It puts things into a weird perspective. So as a younger man, I viewed Saddam Hussein as I saw him from the news, a terrible tyrant, a dictator, somebody who needs to be taken out of power. In my older years, my opinion of him has, just tapered down a little bit, and so you have to just take this into context. It's never just black and white. And so undeniably, he came into power and was kind of this larger-than-life figure. He was Saddam, and, was kind of ruling and, being a man of the people. Of course, having a strong military presence as well. And, trying to... he got into fights with Iran. He got into fights with Kuwait. We of course, had the Gulf War. And all of these kind of various kind of skirmishes with Saddam, but nothing truly... diabolical until the U.S. invasion of Iraq, in previous years. But, he was this kind of larger-than-life character, but he maintained the peace. So as bad as he was, he did maintain the peace. And what came after his rule was nothing short of chaos. And if you ever listen to international news, whether it's Australian or Russian or anything else, they'll publicly just straight up say it. The U.S. going into Iraq was a complete mistake because it destabilized the region completely, and caused hundreds of thousands and millions of people to suffer. Here's two excellent videos that I found. The video on the left-hand side is from an ex-CIA analyst on Saddam Hussein, interviewing him and talking about his sort of life, right, and who he is. And the video on the right-hand side is a little longer, but I highly, highly recommend for you to watch this just for your personal edification. Because I saw this video, and, you know, it does start to put some things into more of a context for you. Because this is Saddam Hussein after the U.S. came in and essentially conquered the territory and region, and he was put on trial in court. And famously says, "I am not defending myself, I'm defending you," as the judge keeps trying to mess with him. And essentially, from what he says here, he knows he's going to die. He knows that he's being sentenced to death and execution, and they ended up hanging him. But this is sort of his last words. And he's telling the Iraqi people and the nation, be careful of America. You have just sold your soul, and the United States and the foreign interests are going to come in. He's like, I'm not scared. I'm a lion, you know? And then like the courtroom, the some of the lawyers start to kind of chatter and whatever else. And then he turns to like some of his like comrades and friends, and he's like, don't worry about them. A lion is never concerned when a monkey keeps talking in the trees or something like this. Like, you know, like, number one, the analogy is hilarious, but like, you know, just the sheer cojones and the machismo of this guy, you know, like, you know, decades of like just rule, you know, nothing phases him. And so sort of unscared with death, he's essentially tells the court how it is and what just happened to Iraq, that they sold their entire freedoms and everything else. And so very interesting to watch if you have time. Fast forwarding a little bit, if anyone remembers, in approximately 2010, we had the Arab Spring Revolt. This was in Egypt primarily, but spread to a few of the Arabic countries around. And this was kind of just a out of nowhere situation where people were just fed up with the previous ruler and they revolted, right? They had demonstrations because they were tired of the human rights violations, the political corruption, the economic decline, unemployment, etc. Social media played a big role because now everyone's just recording stuff and putting it on YouTube. And so, you know, the hope was back in the day that Egypt and all of these surrounding countries were suddenly going to become democratic, right? All of these authoritarian regimes would just topple over, and democracy would flow in. However, that is not what happened. Egypt, essentially, even today, is controlled by a military dictatorship. Morocco still has a monarchy. Jordan still has a monarchy. Lebanon is still fighting corruption. Libya was absolutely destroyed after Gaddafi was ousted. And the Fox News, they keep just saying Hillary Clinton, Benghazi, and just like yelling at the camera. But the entire region just has not gotten a hold of, let's say a true kind of democracy in a parliament or anything else. All of them are kind of being ruled by authoritarian leaders. And so it's a very interesting analysis of, that entire region of the world under Islam, under Ottoman rule, used to be under a single sultan, right? A single ruler. And now everyone is still kind of individually having that type of rule. And so as the Egyptians, right, were having all of this hope, all of these demonstrations for peace and love and a new government, and, ending the repression, they were kind of sorely mistaken at what the outcome would be. And so I even remember during this time, I wanted to go to Egypt to do some archaeological work and digs, right, during my UCLA undergrad career. And so I wanted to come in and spend time with some of the best professors that around the world and do the archaeological digs and sites. But the Arab Spring Revolt happened, and of course my mom coming to me and saying, "You're not going anywhere, like what the heck are you thinking? The whole revolt's happening." Because once again, once the revolt happens, nobody knows how it's going to turn out. Once these folks here beautifully are kind of demonstrating their civil protests towards the status quo and situation, You have no idea. It could turn into a beautiful democracy. It could turn into a new authoritarian regime. It could turn into a civil war. Like, you just don't know. And, you know, the whole Khomeini Iran situation demonstrates that perfectly. And here's a couple of videos on the aftermath of Egypt individually, kind of looking at the Arab Spring Revolt and its aftermath. Was it successful? Was it not? And how they are living today. Very interesting to look if you have some spare time. ISIS. So like I said, the destabilization in the Middle East with the US-Iraq war had numerous consequences. And one of the, as the CIA term is, blowback. One of the blowbacks was that we had... ISIS come into the fray, because since Iraq was not having that dictator of Saddam anymore, the religious extremism under ISIS really came into fruition, with them really gaining steam in 2014, taking over numerous cities, expanding, started going on social media and saying we are going to have a new caliphate, spreading from Africa all the way into the Middle East and India, like just a new huge empire. They were very brutal, very religiously repressive. They were beheading people left and right. As a historian, sadly, they were going into various museums and just destroying history and Assyrian art and everything else that was not connected to their ideological belief system. And they started getting into Syria and started getting into the Syrian civil war, where even once again, right, Egypt was an example. Now Syria is an example. Syria had this bloody, and even today, this terrible civil war that would just destroyed the country, caused hundreds of thousands of refugees to go into Turkey, to go into Europe. Germany accepted hundreds of thousands. France accepted so many hundreds of thousands of immigrants coming in and refugees. Even 2 years ago, when I was in France, I was in Paris, right, kind of just visiting and doing my thing. Even on the subway and the metro, there were Syrian families there, still poor, asking for money, right? It was just absolutely terrible and heartbreaking. Like this civil war just tearing the nation apart. But this is an interesting dynamic because typically, let's say the U.S. narrative or the U.S. situation with Iraq was, well, they have weapons of mass destruction. We're just going to do what we want to do and just come in and conquer and do what we need to do. And around the world, that was seen as an absolute blunder and, let's say, not adherence to international law. But the Syrian perspective was different. Americans had the same notion. He's a tyrant. He needs to go. But this time, Russia, for the first time since the Cold War, came out and said, no, we are going to back Assad. Look what happened to Iraq when you took out Saddam Hussein. The whole region was destabilized. Terrorism went up. All of this craziness went up. And Russia has a vested interest in keeping the status quo in the Middle East because even if you turn on Russian news or anything, even they have terrorist bombings in various metros and other locations. And so, you know, Russia's a lot closer to the Middle East than the United States is. And so they do not want all of this chaos near their borders. And so they, for the last few years, have been maintaining President Assad's hold on Syria and propping him up, right, and to consolidate power. And so whether that's a good message or not, time will tell. But I think definitely time has told the tale of destabilizing an entire country and what the possible blowback could be as far as the U.S. perspective goes. And so having images like this, right, of ISIS members, as we've seen in the news plenty of times, of, you know, the freedom fighters kind of going in with their AK-47s and their Toyota Tundra trucks, kind of repossessed from a lot of the U.S. materials left behind. The Syrian civil war, just tragic, leaving entire cities barren, and the entire place and situation just absolutely devastated. and showing us the foreign politics of Russia finally intervening and upholding Assad. This is from a very recent photo in June or July of 2020. And so President Putin is definitely trying to maintain some semblance of, power and peace relations here. And so now, as a world history class, we have to kind of analyze these various modalities and these various hegemonies and say which process is more effective, the U.S. model or, let's say, the Russian model. The U.S. clearly saying this person is oppressive and they're a tyrant, we have to get rid of them. As soon as they get rid of them, they have no answer or solution, and the whole region destabilized into chaos. The Russian system is, he might be an SOB, but he's maintaining the peace. That's good enough for us, right? So pick your poison. And so my last thoughts on this, and before I continue with my last thoughts, let me just preface it by saying that recently in the news, Lebanon was having a terrible time with their massive explosion. So, this, July 2020. Yeah, they had the massive explosion, and, prayers go out to all of them, and hopefully things get better. But, yeah, definitely the Middle East is continuing to see heartache. But my last thoughts on all of this is the Middle East obviously has a very long and rich history, very nuanced, very interesting to study as a teacher, as a historian perspective, hopefully for you as well. There have been many long stints of good long rule, stable imperial rule, as we've seen. However, in my analysis and perspective, as soon as the Middle East started to come into the industrialization age and Europe's hegemony started to flow and come up, the Middle East just started to destabilize. It wasn't what it used to be. The Armenian Genocide occurred in the early 20th century as power slipped away from the Ottomans. The entire Middle East was redrawn arbitrarily by American and European powers that understood nothing about the religious and ethnic divisions in the territories, leading to an enormous amount of civil war and strifes and religious conflicts, forcing some people like Saddam Hussein to rule with an iron fist. Otherwise, the Sunnis and the Shiites were at each other's throats. Rising of terrorist organizations due to Western interference, as we've seen in 9/11, as we've seen in terrorist bombings all around the world. All of this CIA blowback, unintended consequences for all of these actions. It somehow seems that imperial rule or autocracy or some authoritarian regimes in the region, it just seems to work. That's what's working right now, and is in, let's say, places like Morocco and Tunisia, it's maintaining peace. And so whether you agree with it or not, the results are kind of on the table. And so will the Middle East eventually, or all these various countries, implement true democracy, whatever that is, in whatever form or facet? Who knows? But, probably not anytime soon. And so kind of leaving us with that message of the Middle East is very tumultuous, very interesting, has a rich history, and has the capability of suddenly rising up in all of this kind of fiery passion and protest when need be, albeit with some unintended consequences sometimes. And so with that, I leave you with this. Here we have, the end of the chapter. So I just want to thank you very, very much for being here, for listening. And I really hope that you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it. And hopefully that brings a little more context into the Middle East for us, for our world history class. Thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you next time. Take care.